So we're here with period 4, and the smartboard is working better today, so I'm recording this lecture for those of you who are absent, and we're beginning chapter 4. This is basically pages 66 through 76 of the textbook, and if you're on your OneNote and you're following along and taking notes, you'll probably notice that this PowerPoint's different from what you have in your OneNote. I updated it. If you want the updated version, you can download it from Moodle, but you don't have to do that. As long as you take notes, that's all that's important. You'll probably notice that your PowerPoint's going to have more slides. I've been trying to downsize them, so you guys probably end up having more information. So our two main questions for this chapter, there's these two overarching questions. The first one is, what was the human Jesus like? Or in other words, what was the historical Jesus like? So this focuses on not just what Jesus did in his saving mission, but what kind of person was he like? What was he like as a boy? And in answering this question, we're going to look at his parents, because we're all formed by our parents, and the way we can understand Jesus is by looking at Mary and Joseph and who they were and how they formed him to be this really brave, prayerful Jewish man. And Jesus couldn't have been who he was as a man without Mary and Joseph. So we're going to look at Mary and Joseph. We're going to do a little project with Mary in class, and we're going to have a reflective prayer service with Joseph to learn about Joseph. So we're also going to watch a documentary, and it's from the Discovery Channel. So if you're absent, you can, if you have Netflix, you can watch it on Netflix. Otherwise, I'll show it in class. Either I could show it before school or at lunch. So if you missed the documentary, you got to watch it, because it's a big part of explaining who the historical Jesus is. It's called Who is Jesus? And as I said, it's available on Netflix, and we're going to watch episode 1. And I have a study guide for it. It's in your OneNote, but you're not going to use OneNote to do it, because when I have students watch movies with their computers open, they play on the computer and don't watch their videos. So you'll do it on paper and then turn it in. And so that's the first question we're looking at. The second question is, why did God have to become human? I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that before, but he's God, right? Why does he need to become human to bring about salvation? So we're going to answer that question. And we're going to look just briefly at the saving mission of God that's accomplished through Jesus Christ. And we'll get more detailed into his mission and a lot of the narratives as we go on. But we're just going to do an overview of the theological idea behind the Incarnation. Why does Jesus become a human being? So today, we're just starting with the human side of Jesus. And the first thing your book asks is, how was Jesus like us? And the first idea we have is the idea of the Incarnation. That Jesus was both fully human and fully divine. So as it says here, the word incarnation comes from the Latin root in incarnate, meaning into the flesh. So this idea is the idea that Jesus is fully divine, but at the fullness of time is the phrase the church uses, and I think it comes from St. Paul. At the fullness of time, he becomes human without losing his divine nature. So at the fullness of time, he becomes human, and now he's fully divine and fully human. And when you're understanding the Incarnation, when you're defining it, you have to have both of those pieces. It's important to understand that, for example, Jesus isn't like Hercules. Remember, Hercules was like half God and half man. He's not like a demigod. He's not sort of God and sort of human. He's fully human and fully divine. He was always with God, but at the fullness of time, he becomes a human being to bring about God's plan for salvation. And so that's important to understand. He was always with God, but for us, our understanding of history would say, okay, this happened in the 1st century. Yeah, go ahead. And then it was actually about the year 4 in the Common Era that he became a human being. So another idea, does anyone have any questions on that? This you should be able to define. Every Christian should be able to explain the Incarnation, the idea that God is both fully human and fully divine. You may not completely understand it. It's kind of a mystery, but you should be able to define this word. Another word they have in your book, it's on page 67, and it relates to this slide. On page 67, they introduce the idea of the hypostatic union. Hypostatic union. The Incarnation describes the idea that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. The hypostatic union kind of further explains, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say Jesus is fully human and fully divine? Well, here they explain, and again, this page number reference over here is incorrect. That's for a paper textbook. On page 67, they describe the idea that Jesus has a human soul, a human body, a human intellect, and a human will. That's why we have to learn to understand Jesus in his historical context. He is human. He had to grow up just like we do. He had to learn just like we do. He got sick just like we do. Everything that we experience, with the exception of sin, Jesus experienced. But what does that mean in relation to his divine nature? That's what the hypostatic union explains. The hypostatic union is the idea that Jesus has a human will. He has the human will, and he has a divine will. And this term will is sort of a philosophical term. I think the best way for us to understand it is consciousness. So he has this human consciousness, this divine consciousness, united in the one person of Jesus Christ. So this is describing the nature of the Incarnation. Well, how does the Incarnation work? He has a human will and a divine will, but they're united in the person of Christ. And that idea that they're united is important. It's not as if Jesus has a human side and a divine side. He's not half and half. It's not as if he's like schizophrenic and he has like this human consciousness and this divine consciousness, and they're not together within his own self. They are united. So Jesus knows the Father's will, but he's also fully human. He also has his own free will himself. But it's this idea of this union of the divine will and his human will within the single person. And again, it's sort of hard to understand. Part of this is a mystery, so you may not be able to fully comprehend it. But think of all of us. We have our human nature, and then we have our soul. So there's a part of us that sort of, is going to, our soul needs to be in the body. We're embodied creatures, but we sort of have an aspect to our own selves that's we have this human body and then we have our soul. It's not exactly the same, but I guess it's a little similar. Are there any questions on this? So you should be able just to define these two terms. We're going to talk more about, we're going to start with the human side of Jesus, and then we're going to look at his divine mission. So we're going to look at, what was God's divine will for him. So we're going to look at the hypostatic union in this chapter. So how is Jesus like us? One of the ways we're going to learn about Jesus is we're going to learn about his parents. So we're going to, as soon as I finish this lecture, we're going to start a little mini Mary project. We're going to, each family is going to do a presentation on Mary. Each member of the family will do one of these pieces on Mary from the chapter. So in your book, it describes all these things, and you're going to look them up and create a presentation. So we're going to celebrate Mary. And your book has a big section on her. Then for Joseph, we're going to have a prayer service. It's a prayer service that has guided meditation. It has some reflection with music and looking at artwork of St. Joseph. And then it has a hands piece where you write a letter to your St. Joseph. Whoever in your life is Joseph. It doesn't necessarily have to be a dad. It could be your mom. It could be a coach. It could be a grandfather. But we're going to do that to learn about Joseph. And the second piece, there's only one other lecture for this chapter, and that's looking at Jesus' divine mission, and that will come later. So, and then also, as I said, we'll watch that documentary. And the last slide here on this presentation just reminds us that Jesus comes from this context of the Hebrew Bible. As Christians, we believe that the coming of Christ was foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus is Jewish, Mary's Jewish, Joseph's Jewish. They're not Christians. The early church was a Jewish church, and we end up breaking away, and we'll study that next semester, how the church kind of develops into its own religion. But as Christians, we recognize that there are many Old Testament passages that foreshadow or prefigure Jesus. Here we have the famous quote from Isaiah that a young woman will have a child and call him Emmanuel. That's why we call Jesus Emmanuel. We read these scriptures usually during an Advent time and Christmas time. We also see that the Messiah was promised in the Old Testament would be a son of David. We see that Jesus has a Davidic lineage. There's from the prophet Micah, the prediction of the wise men from the east. And these are just a few. You could find many more. In chapter 3, we're going to study about how Jesus is the suffering servant. We really do believe that the suffering servant in Isaiah didn't just merely refer to the prophet Isaiah. We feel that Jesus is the fulfillment of that idea of the suffering servant. But keep that in mind. Also, always keep in mind when we as Christians read the Hebrew Bible, they're not just our texts. They are Jewish texts, and they have a different interpretation within the context of the Hebrew Bible. We always have to be respectful of that. And remember last year when we studied the 4 levels of interpretation of Scripture? We had the literal level. This is the allegorical level when we look for Christian allegories in the Old Testament. But never, ever forget that these texts stand on their own as Jewish scriptures, and we should always be mindful and respectful of that. So that's how we're starting. Again, there's not a lot of lecture for this chapter. It's mostly in-class activities. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to refer you to your OneNote, and we're going to go over the Mary Project and get started in class. If you're absent, then you're going to need to talk with your family when you get back. All right? So you guys want to give a shout out to the absent people?
See ya.
See ya. Say, get well.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Oh, what if they have a sport or something? All right. Thank you.